Hey, welcome to week 3 of SED 445. We're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about culture. So this is a behavior class. So why are we talking about culture? Well, culture kind of defines to us what's acceptable or expected. And we know that people are largely a part of, a product of their environments. And culture we'll talk about just, in a broad definition of things, things like ethnicity, race, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, that is a big one, and most importantly, family structure. So when we think about the culture of a family, family is, part of your culture. When you walk through someone's door into their home, what their culture is. You get a sense of, what's acceptable and unacceptable in this culture, in this family, okay? So we have to understand that we all bring a little piece of our culture that's embedded in us into our everyday lives. And when we have that understanding, we can a lot of times avoid misunderstandings because we won't misperceive behaviors of others as or take it personally. So let's dig into it a little bit more. To be effective when they interact with students, teachers must keep in mind 2 culturally influenced factors. So first of all, styles of interaction. So how they communicate with us. Do they look you in the eye? Think about the body language, okay? Also, response to authority figures. So maybe a student is coming from a home that is very, very strict. And so it's yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, or sir. And the response to authority figures is, more obedient, for lack of a better term. But then, on the other side of the spectrum, we might meet a child who talks to us as if he or she is an adult. So you can kind of start to understand what the culture of their home may look like, or the culture of their family. What's acceptable at home? So without adequate knowledge and understanding of different cultures, styles of interactions, and responses to authority figures, a teacher might misinterpret a student's behavior. And this can result in conflicts in the classroom. So I'll give you another example. In many cultures that I know of, it is disrespectful to look someone in the eye. Now, for me, I like to have people look me in the eye because it is a sign of respect, and I'm more lenient on, people when I know that is part of their culture. I don't want to say lenient, but I'm more understanding when I understand it's part of their culture, or maybe even, if they're on the spectrum, I don't even expect them to look me in the eye. So with that understanding, you can avoid a lot of misinterpretation. Other influences on behavior. So we need to recognize that typical styles of interaction between students or between a student and an adult might vary from one culture to the next. So like that example that I just talked about, where students or children may speak to their family a little bit differently than what you may have been raised to speak to an adult. So therefore, a teacher needs to understand how culture can influence a student's interaction with others and interpretation of others' interactions. The way in which students interact with adults and peers in their homes might be different from what is typically considered appropriate in a school setting, just like I just mentioned. Interaction styles across cultures might vary in regard to degree of directness. So when we think of directness, are they more passive, or are they very direct with what they are trying to communicate? Level of emotionality. So cultural variations exist in the extent to outward signs of emotion. So in some cultures, expressing any emotion is a sign of weakness. And in other cultures, it's not. So it's really, the level of emotionality that is embedded in their culture. Degree of movement. So we think about physical movement or even contact. So you think about those close talkers. We all know one that gets a little too close, and you might want to take a step back because, that may raise your anxiety. So it's really important to keep that in mind. Verbal turn taking. We've all been exposed to that person who will interrupt you mid-sentence, but maybe that is acceptable at home to just kind of interject. Like, I've been in a home where the family's all talking at once, nobody's taking turns, and that's just part of their culture. So expressions of consideration, so they may show more consideration by refraining from behaviors that might offend. Likewise, students might show consideration for others by being tolerant of behaviors that they find unpleasant or offensive. So I have been in many classrooms where students have been just super tolerant of others, and other children just have had it with another student's behavior. So it's really, where they may be being taught at home or what may be their tolerance level for others. Maybe they have brothers or sisters at home. Attitudes towards personal space, we kind of talked about that earlier. So someone, that close talker, and attitudes towards sharing. So some families don't share. They may have a lot of brothers and sisters, and they have to guard their toys, with their life. Otherwise, big sister's gonna start cutting the Barbie's hair off. So, when we start thinking about these cultural influences on behavior, we can understand the student or even ourselves a little bit more. Social construction, assumptions, and stereotype. So we're all products of our culture, experiences, and education, and so therefore we're all socially constructed. And in order to understand our students and the families that we're working with, we have to understand ourselves and how we view the world and what we may perceive as expected or unexpected or rude. So what are some examples of factors that influence how we, or you in particular, are socially constructed? So think about how might these factors influence how we, or you in particular, are socially constructed. Consider the flip sides of what is your social construction. How might these different influences influence communication and interactions between teachers and or families? So start thinking about your own culture a little bit, what you know to be, socially acceptable or unacceptable within your own culture. So some big ideas. Teachers' beliefs about student behavior may determine effectiveness in classroom management. So when we start to have more of a growth mindset on culture and behavior, and understand that behavior is something that we can certainly correct and teach, it might have an effect on classroom management. A teacher's theoretical perspective will drive decisions about interactions. So what are your beliefs about students, student groups, and student behavior? So start thinking about that. Consider your social construction schema. What perspectives, views, or beliefs spring from your experiences and who you are? So with this, we have to kind of understand, excuse me, that not all families adhere to the basic premise of positive behavior supports. And I've worked with plenty of those parents that have said, why are we rewarding them for doing their job? Why are we rewarding them for doing what they're supposed to be doing? And of course, you could get into, that argument of, well, we're here at work because we're getting a paycheck. But sometimes it's not appropriate to go there with a teacher, so just beware. Positive behavior support reflects certain cultural values, and that's why it's really important to be careful with that conversation, and that the ways of shaping a child's behavior should not be punishing. So not punishing, by definition, or a loose definition, just means that teachers and families will not use aversive techniques to change a child's behaviors. And those aversive techniques we discussed in our last lecture, if you want to go back and review those. So cultural diversity in the classroom. So let's talk a little bit about statistics here. So the U.S. Census projects that populations of people of color will significantly increase, becoming a majority by 2050. So while diversity in schools is growing, segregation in schools is actually rising. So when we think about segregation, you know, it's not what we may have used as the definition, but we also think of, you know, segregation of students with poverty, etc. So again, percentage of children living in poverty is rising significantly. So there has been a growing amount of research about how poverty actually affects the brain. So if you're ever interested in that, I also know Ruby Payne is a great author that specializes in discussing poverty. So you might want to check those out as well. I'm on a tangent here. I'm going to come back to this. Percentage of children who speak a language other than English at home is increasing, and teachers need to be prepared to teach effectively students of all backgrounds. I mean, we could certainly assume that, but that is something that we need to, you know, be keeping in mind when we're walking into the classroom. So the values, traditions, worldview, and social and political relationships created, shared, and transformed by a group of people bound together by a common history, geographic location, language, social class, religion, or other shared identity. There's the definition of culture. So when we're thinking about culture, we've got to include all of these things, but also let's think about the world that we're living in today and think about how technology could apply to this definition of culture that we have today. So, you know, I'm fairly young, but I mean, when I'm working with a group of young students, and here's a great example. I wrote up on the board what is now known as the hashtag sign, and that was my abbreviation for number. We were working on, I think, a math problem, and so I wrote up on the board, you know, finish number 1 through whatever. And a student said, "Why are you writing a hashtag up on the board?" So it was just things like that. Hadn't even dawned on me, but that's their culture, is just very embedded in technology, and so we have to kind of embrace that a little bit. Whether we like it or not, we need to embrace a lot of this. Otherwise, that's where misunderstandings pop up. Classroom management problems and challenging behaviors exhibited by individual students may result from teachers' practices rather than students' problems. So, for instance, something about the teacher's behavior may be contributing to the situation. So why is this good news? Well, the good news is we can change our behavior. It's much easier as a teacher to change or adapt our behavior than try to change that of another person. And now I'm just using this to kind of illustrate that when we open up our minds and, you know, take a look at ourselves and what we're doing, maybe we are contributing to a student's behavior. So I'm coming up on my 15-minute mark, but I appreciate you watching this short video, and just, you know, think about those questions that I asked earlier on and how your culture or your perceptions may be shaping some of the, you know, even inner misunderstandings you may be having about student behavior. Does it shape what you're expecting of them or what your classroom expectations may be? So just Things to think about, and I look forward to seeing you on the discussion boards. Take care.